So I've chosen to talk about homesteading in Desert Hot Springs through the lens of my own family history. And I've chosen to place my family within the framework of national and even international events that were happening at the time. I hope I hope you'll find it interesting, and hopefully it'll also be informative. The main characters in this family are the Hemmingsen family of San Pedro, California, and a family friend of theirs named John Riley, who eventually married into that family. And for those of you who get confused, which some like me may, my dear daughter Sarah, who's running the projector and helped me with this thing, she printed out a little genealogy of the people, and there are 10 copies. So if you get confused, this is the Hemmingsen family. So I'm gonna hand it there, and you can share it or whatever. But hopefully you won't need to. Okay. So when I came into doing this idea, I took all these stories that I'd heard all my life, and that I'd taken for granted, and started trying to figure out how much of it was fact, what was it based on, and I came to know that I needed to do a whole lot more research. So I'm going to start with the fact that the desert, the Coachella Valley, was big and bare, and they had to survey it. So the first survey was done based on this benchmark. It is on the top of Mount San Jacinto. There's another one on San Gorgonio, and of course there are other ones in different places. And you guys in the Park Service would know a whole lot more about that than I do. But in 1885, the Coachella Valley was first surveyed by U.S. Army Colonel Harry Washington. It was resurveyed or additionally surveyed in 1857 by a more prominent person, Edward Beale. And you may read about him if you read history, where it talks about him taking the camels through the desert on the Bradshaw Trail so that he could do his survey work. They came up the Bradshaw Trail. There's kind of a picture of it on here too, so later, lots of small print. But they came up the Bradshaw Trail from Blythe up along and over to Mecca, and then back, kind of working its way in and up the valley, what we would know as the 10, which wasn't the 10, of course, at the time. So they divided it up into plats. This one is an original. This is Township 3 South, North 5, or 5 North. And that's the one that Riley happens to have settled on. That's the one that connects with my family. It's a little bit difficult to see, so the next slide shows a bit more about how it was divided up. So this one with the little blue thing here is the area that I'm mostly going to talk about. Okay? Let's see. The next one shows it a little more clearly. So here's the big plat, and this little square right there inside of the other one is that section. So it's a quarter. Yeah.
How big is
this little square right there is 160 acres. And so each little square, or little plat, was divided up into 460 acre sections. And that's what he homesteaded. Yes, Sarah?
It's not showing in this image, but this particular 160 acre homestead was approved in 1912.
Yes, it was. Okay. So that's about mostly what I'm going to be talking about. And you can see that Desert Hot Springs is clear up here. So we're out in the country. We're about 5 miles from the actual town of Desert Hot Springs. Okay, next slide. Okay, the Civil War came along, and in 1861, and a lot of people started coming west to avoid the war, at which time the government decided that there ought to be settling out here. And so they the government devised a number of different homestead acts, but the most important one, for our purposes anyway, was the Homestead Act of 1862, which provided that any adult citizen or intended citizen who had never borne arms against the U.S. government could claim 160 acres of surveyed government land. They didn't ask the Native Americans, they just divided it up. Claimants were required to live on and improve their property by cultivating the land. And they had 5 years to do it in. After 5 years on the land, if they had done what they were supposed to, they could prove up on it, which is why John Riley came out in 1908, but his actual land didn't belong to him until 1912, because he had that 5 years of working on the land. Now there were several amendments to the Homestead Act, one of which was called the Desert Land Act in 1877, and that in that one they wanted to promote the economic development of the area, and so those people had to not only quote improve, they had to plant things, and it cost them money because that was not the same as a homestead. They were you could get 640 acres at $1.25 an acre to a married couple. Now, of course, that's big money back in that day, right? But if you were single, you got the same amount of land, but it cost you, you got half the amount of land, but it cost you the same amount of money. You had to promise to irrigate that land within the 5 years and submit proof. But as water was relatively scarce, there was a lot of cheating that went on, where people would just bring buckets of water and dump it on the land for irrigating. So some people say that Hilda Gray, one of the early pioneers in Desert Hot Spring, obtained her land through the Desert Land Act, although she only had 160 acres. So I don't know if that's true or not, but that her 160 acres is down in what we now call Dos Palmos, down on kind of on the corner of Bubbling Wells. I'm sorry, of Palm and Dillon, kind of right in that section there. So anyway, in 1875, the railroad came in, and Sarah, I found this picture in all that stuff. So this was a picture of one of the early rail cars. In 1875, the Southern Pacific Railroad began laying tracks through the Coachella Valley. And in 1876, it went from Los Angeles to Coachella. And in 1877, it went on from Coachella all the way down to Yuma. You can do the next slide, sir. And because of the federal government's granting of 10 miles of odd numbered sections to the railroad, all along our valley, you'll see there's a section that's bare and a section that's settled, and a section that's bare and a section that's settled. That's because the railroad owned 10 miles, and then the next section was open for development. Now, when it came time for the Indians of Palm Springs and the other tribes to be given their reservation land, some of the land was already gone because it belonged to the railroad. So some of it went to the Native Americans in those even numbered sections. So anyway, let's see. Land in Desert Hot Springs wasn't part of that because it was outside the range of that 10-mile division. So it was available, and that's one of the reasons why people came here to homestead. The next event, and I don't have a slide for it because you don't need it, is the invention of the telephone in 1876. And by the way, if you want to turn yours off, that's fine. And And in 1879, the invention of the light bulb, another very important thing. Now I'm going to go from history into family background. So in Emma Jorgensen and Rasmus Peter Hemmingsen came from Denmark to the United States. They both ended up in San Francisco and met each other out in what the description in the book says was a rough section of the area. And apparently Rasmus was kind of a rough character, according to his ancestors. So they were there for 3 years, had 3 kids in that, or maybe a little longer than that, but they had 3 children in San Francisco, and then they moved to San Pedro, and everybody moved to San Pedro. So these are my relatives. This is on my mother's side. So of these people, 3 were prominent in desert history. Most of them came to the desert at some point and had houses here in the desert. The only one who did not was Rob, and he went to Seattle, which connects in a whole other crazy way that you don't need to know. But anyway, they were in San Pedro, but they kept coming out to the desert. So Anne was born in 1882, my great aunt, and you'll see other pictures of her. That's Anne. Okay. Maddie, Matilda Alma, my great grandmother, that one, and Walter, my great grand uncle, is that one. Oh no, I'm sorry. It's that one. Walter. Okay. The little one in front is George. Not that you need to know that. One other important birth happened in 1882. John William Riley, called Jack, or in my family, just Riley. Everybody called him Riley. He was born in somewhere we think New York, and married my Aunt Anne in 1920 after she was widowed. He was the first one to apply for a patent of land in Desert Hot Springs in 1808 under the Homestead Act, even before Cabot Yerxa. I have to keep throwing that in because Cabot got all the press. Shortly before that, in 1898, Spanish-American War broke out, and Riley went, and that's in his uniform for the Spanish-American War. He was listed in the census in 1930 as being someone who was a veteran of that war. And the other thing that was important that happened around then in 1903, do you know that one? The Wright brothers flew their first airplane in 1903. Now, my grandma Maddie was growing up quickly. In fact, she's the source of my family's first great scandal. It seems she met a man. This is my grandma Maddie, and that is Florimond Boiserain. Ooh. I know. They called him Frenchie. Of course they did. Over there in one of the display cases, I have a little scarf that made in France that belonged to her. So anyway, Sarah, is the next one? Does the next one have that slide? Yeah, there we go. This was in the newspaper. Oh my God. Fond lover lands in jail. Florimond Boiserain is not the name of a gay troubadour strumming on the guitar, but of a Basque who has loved fondly and too well for He is now in the county jail. For a long time past, the young man, he is 25 years of age, has been a devoted admirer at the shrine of Matilda Hemmingsen. They had Hemmingsen, but they had to change it later. A 17-year-old girl who, among a certain set at San Pedro, was regarded as a belle. The attentiveness of the young Basque were said not to have been discouraged by the family of the girl, but time slipped away and never was there a word said about marriage. That was all right too, for Maddie now was only a very little past 17 years of age. And so no cold water was thrown upon the billing and cooing of the couple. Remember, this is in the newspaper. But some little time ago, it became apparent that Maddie Hemmingsen ought to be married. And still Boiser Rain held back. Time drifted along and the family of the girl came to the conclusion that drastic measures must be adopted in order to inspire the recalcitrant lover with the proper amount of ardor. With that end in view, a complaint was sworn out in Justice Pearson's court against Boiser Rain, charging him with seduction in the last year. He was arrested yesterday at San Pedro by Constable Klein. Now the Basque is under lock and key, and it is with him to determine whether it is to be a case of state's prison or wedding. Isn't it lovely to have your dirty laundry in the whole world? Yeah. Anyway, he chose to get married, and their daughter Gladys was born in 1904, and Maddie and Frenchie got married 10 days later. Okay, going on, my Aunt Anne married Carl Atkinson in 1905, and they had a son also named Carl, who owned the southwest corner of Dillon Road and Bubbling Wells in later years, and if you're driving by, you can still see the fenced area, although someone else owns it now. Now, in 1905, there was a leak in the Colorado River through the canal system, and the Salton Sea began to form. Oh yeah, by the way, that's just a picture of John Riley's claim, which I'm going to get to in a minute. The Salton Sea was created, and Jack had been working for the railroad as the maintenance of way supervisor. By the way, I just found this out yesterday. We always wondered what brought him out to the desert. I talked to a relative of his I didn't even know existed, but he saw it on Facebook and called me. And we talked for an hour and a half yesterday. So here's what we found out. That he was the maintenance of way person, and when he'd been working on the railroad to maintain the line. And when the Salton Sea started to form, it started covering the trestle over which the railroad had been traveling. And so with the idea that they were going to have to reroute the whole railroad system, Jack said, I'm not going to do that. So he quit the railroad and decided to settle down near an area called Seven Palms Station. And that's kind of east of Garnet Hill, but it's not, you know where Garnet is, west of Garnet Hill, but this was a little bit east, Seven Palms Station.
Mountain View and Dillon, Mountain View
and Dillon, but
Mountain View and 20th.
I'm sorry, what?
Mountain View and 20th.
Yeah, I'll explain that a little bit better, but anyway, he went out and decided to find a place that he had been looking at as he went back and forth on the train, and decided that this looked like a promising site. And so in 1908, he applied for a 160-acre homestead, 1/4 of a section from what is now Mountain View to Bubbling Wells, from Dillon Road to 18th. Okay? Of course, there weren't any road names then. There weren't any real roads then. So his section neighbors became Neela McCarter, August Schleider, and John Quincy Sane. Hilda Gray's homestead that was filed in 1912 was northwest of him, like I said, in the present area of Dos Palmos. Palm to Avenida Manzana, Camino Campanero to Camino Aventura, if you know where those things are. And then Cabot Yerxa's property was north of him and filed in 1912. Filed for in 1912. So that's why Riley had proved up before Cabot actually filed. So anyway, there were some challenges, as you may imagine, and I tried to do them in some kind of order. The first was that there were no real roads from the train station at Garnet in this direction. By the way, when I talk about Garnet, it's going to be it had a lot of different names, and so I'm gonna be referring to that area that we commonly know now as Garnet, but it might have been a little one way or the other, but it's basically right there.
Is that where the train station is, Randa?
Well, the train station is further to the west.
Yeah, right, okay.
Yeah, and what we call Garnet is actually where Indian and the freeway cross,
Right, okay.
but it's the area I'm gonna refer to as Garnet. So anyway, they had to go all cross country, and it was difficult to do it in a car. There were a lot of cactus in the way, a lot more than there are now, by the way. Next, yeah, there we go. That's my Aunt Ann later years standing in the cactus. That's on the corner of Bubbling Wells and Dillon, in the cactus garden. So they used mules or horses to bring, and wagons to bring water and supplies and building materials across the desert, because everything had to be brought from somewhere else. US 99, Varner Road ran from Eden or Thousand Palms up to Garnet in 1912, but it was dirt. It was not a road at that point yet. That was not put in that early. And so Mountain View didn't connect to that until later when the Rock House gas station was built on Highway 99. So there was no roads. There was no water, except what you could find in an oasis. So you had to dig or drill a well. And there was no artesian, that's, by the way, that's Riley. I'm sorry, that's Ann Riley, my great aunt, and that's my great grandmother, that's my grandmother, Gladys. So she came out to the desert, and that's why you see her there. And they were still bringing water at that time on wagon. Okay, next slide. So there was some artesian water down in what is known now as Willow Hole. It was also known as Willow Hole then. Do you guys know where Willow Hole is? No. Ever heard of it? If you go down Mountain View Road between Dillon and Verner, on the left hand side there's kind of bushes, and on the right hand side there are two dips, kind of like little valleys. That's Willow Hole, and there was water there.
Is that past the ranch that has the horses and the?
Yeah, past that.
that?
You start going through the little mountain,
Oh, yeah.
and then there are two valleys there.
Okay.
And I'll share more about those in a minute. But so there was no artesian water though on unlike Cabot, there was no artesian water on Riley's land. So they had to use barrels to catch water and carry water. And you couldn't really rely on the water that was in Willow Hole or any of the little oases around there. It kind of came and went along with the season, like it does now. So they had to use the water very sparingly. And I know Cabot talks a lot about how he used the same bucket of water for many, many things. There was no electricity, of course. So all the work had to be done by hand during the daylight hours. And over there I have one of the lamps, I have a lantern somewhere in one of the displays, because there was no way to see. So everybody had to work only in the day, and use lanterns at night, and they had to have windmills to bring up water, an elevated tank house to let the water flow down to the house or whatever. That's Riley and my mother, Virginia Jacobsen, or Virginia. She was Virginia Baldwin at that time. But anyway, that's Riley and she on their car hauling water. Let's see. Electricity came to the Coachella Valley in 1914, but the home that my great grandparents built in 1940 still had gas light, and it's plumbed. Call it plumbed for gas? Anyway, it's plumbed for gas lighting and gas heaters. We didn't get an electric water tank until the 1960s. We relied on gravity feed coming down from the tank house, which was fed by the windmill, and it came down gravity feed to the house and the rest of the place. Right here, this is a picture of my grandma Mattie and Al. This is later on. This is in 35. They were digging a a reservoir, which is still on my property, although now it's full of rocks. But anyway, they were digging it up. It had to be done by hand. So they did have a tractor that came and went that they could rent or borrow or something. But for the most part, a lot of it was done by hand. Let's see. No housing. No housing, no lumber, no cement. That was another challenge that Riley faced. Riley's first house was a dugout made of scrap railroad metal and ties, and it had corrugated iron and a dirt floor with a tarp roof and brush on top of the tarp to help keep it a little bit cooler. Now, the early pioneers used adobe when they could, but if you've got land that's as sandy as ours in our area and didn't have any water at that point, you can't make adobe. So they used scrap and they used brush. So that's Riley standing next to his first house, which is the dugout. Let's see, another challenge was the weather. I don't think I have a slide for that, but you don't need it because you live here and you know what it's like. Right? Heat, wind, drought, and dust. Indio reported that it was 121 degrees on June the 24th, 1929. So the heat has always been here. Cooler, of course, in Desert Hot Springs, but not by much. So they hung wet burlap over the windows, leaving them open for any breeze. They slept outside. They slept, some of them, under the house, or if they happen to have a basement, which all the houses that were built by my family had a basement, which was kind of unusual in this area. But sometimes you could sleep in the basement where it was a little cooler. And they wet their night clothes or use what we call rubbing alcohol to cool yourself off in the night. I remember doing that myself as a child because we didn't have air conditioning or a swamp cooler at that point. So they slept outside under some kind of netting if they could. Anyway, the main thing that they did, which is really bad now, is that they planted the long-rooted tamarisk trees for shade. That's the first house on my grandparents' property and great-grandparents. And you can see that they have trees, tamarisk trees. Now everybody hates them, but they were definitely a godsend in that day. People for heat use oil heaters or wood. They burned wood, brush, dry cactus ribs. They had oil heaters because sometimes it can get cold here, you know that. And they had wood shutters that kept out the wind, but not the dust. I don't know if you can go back a slide, Sarah. You notice here how this house is built they call post and pier, is that right?
Yep.
And this is a window that doesn't have a shutter over it, but the ones on the other side had shutters that they would lift them up and then put them back down when they wanted to keep the cool in or whatever. And I remember my grandmother, years later, my great grandmother, I remember her always saying, when you wake up in the morning, you close all the doors and windows. And when you go to bed at night, you open all the doors and windows so that you can get as much relief from the heat as possible. Okay, food was a challenge. I don't have any pictures of that either. But they ate tinned food because you could keep it and it wasn't in aluminum cans, it was in tins. They ate rabbits and dove and whatever you could shoot or grow. And nuts and seeds were not plentiful except in the oases. And a native palm fruit, we think about palm, they could eat dates. Native dates are not tasty. They don't have any meat on them really. So all the dates that are known here in the Coachella Valley were brought in from somewhere else. So we're known for dates, but they weren't back then. They drank Mormon tea, or sometimes called squaw tea, which is from a local plant called Ephedra virides, kind of diuretic and had ephedrine in it, you know, to make it a little jittery. But anyway, but coffee and tea were the most important things. There was no ice except what could be brought in on the train, and that didn't last very long. So they kept their things cool if they had a basement or under the house, or if they had their well pumping water up into the, you know, windmills, pumping it up into the tank, and then they would have a slow drip that would drip on a box with burlap over it, and that would keep the box cool, kind of. And so they would put their cool things in there. Some people had the metal-lined refrigerators, yeah.
Can you tell us what was negative about those trees?
Oh, well, nowadays they say that tamarisk trees are invasive, they're not native to the desert, and they suck up a ton of water.
Okay.
And they kill everything around it.
The
Yeah,
roots
and
go
they're
down
very
to the
salty,
aquifer,
so you
all
can't
the way
slay
down.
them. Yeah, yeah. I love my tamarisk tree. That's a whole other story. Anyway, they also had critters, snakes, scorpions, vinegaroons, blackberries.
Wait, back up.
Huh?
What did you say?
Vinegar, well, we call them vinegaroons, but they're really sun spiders. They're
They look like a scorpion.
yeah, they're so pugid. They don't have a long tail that sticks up in the back. They're just a big, brown, hairy, spidery looking thing with hairs all over its body. And they do pinch or bite, but only if they're provoked. I know one was in my towel once as a kid, and I got out of the shower and dried myself off with this towel, and there was a vinegar in it, and it bit me. And I didn't get sick or anything, because they're not poisonous, but they are large and scary looking. So, anyway, but we call them vinegaroons, and they really are not.
Yeah.
That's, yeah, they're soul pugids or sun spiders.
You're right.
Okay, let's see. The things that you don't think about: ants, flies.
Yeah.
Talk about pests. No screening windows, eh? Another issue was communication. Communication, because mail only came by stage or train to Garnet. This is a letter to John Riley in 1911. I only have the envelope, unfortunately. But you can see it's dated from San Pedro to Palm Springs Station, California. So it was, at times, Garnet was called Palms in 1875, Seven Palms in 1889, Palm Springs Station in 1900, Pierce in 1906, Gray in 1917, Noria in 1918, and finally in 1923 they started calling it Garnet. It's about the time that long distance telephones were first invented, but of course nobody had them. So, okay, clothing. Most of the people wore dresses. Women wore dresses. And a lot of the pictures I have of family, my grandmother, great-grandmother, my aunt, they're all wearing these heavy, long dresses. They wore aprons to cover up their clothing to protect it, you know. And men wore khakis and Levi's and work clothes. And a lot of them wore wool suits. Don't ask me why in this weather, but they wore wool suits. Difficult to do laundry because they didn't have much water. So maybe they would have one set of clothes for good, and then the rest of their clothes would be, you know, just work stuff with patches and all. Even in the summer, it showed long sleeves and high collars, and they wore button-up shoes and boots. And over there in one of the display cases, there's a button hook that was used to do up your shoes. Okay? And boredom was a challenge. People got bored. There was hard work and long distances and not very many people around. But there were books to read, sewing and mending, and children to take care of. There was cooking and cleaning and care of animals and hunting for meat and raising crops and prospecting. And most of the homesteaders had jobs in addition to trying to prove up on their homestead because they had to have something to live on. they did gather together for barbecues and sings and some religious services, for picnics at Willow Hole and other oases, wagon trips, camping trips to Palm Springs, Andreas Canyon, Murray Canyon, Cathedral Canyon, Randa, Snow Creek. These are all listed in one of the books as places where they went. And they went to the Salton Sea. And there's the Salton, that's his, Riley and my Uncle Art, great Uncle Art, and my grandmother Gladys, and my mother, when she was little, in the Salton Sea. My great grandmother also recalled how the ruts from Riley's place went out like spokes of a wheel. There were just, wagon tracks in different directions because people came and went from there. There was a kind of like a hub in that area because the school was put in on Riley's land. So, anyway, during the years from 1908 to 1910, Riley returned to Los Angeles occasionally to pick up supplies for a more substantial house to the east. Oh, by the way, this is a picture of family. This is my family also, but that's Two Bunch. So if you know where Two Bunch Palms is, that's a picture at Two Bunch.
Wow.
And I only know that because it's written on the back. It's Two Bunch. Okay, so Riley was working on a more substantial house to the east where he eventually put in a well, a windmill, and the 1910 census listed him as single, a bridge carpenter, by the way, which goes back to the railroad thing, right? We wondered why he could be a bridge carpenter. Now we found out. This is a picture of the census, the 1910 census. And there he is listed up there as single, which he was, living on County Road in San Gorgonio. Wasn't called Desert Hot Springs at that time. His early dugout on the corner of Bubbling Wells and Dillon fell to ruins, but in 1912 it became the site of the first school in Desert Hot Springs. And there's a great booklet by Ethel Rouse, My First School, A Hole in the Ground. Been reprinted several times. My copy of the copy that the Historical Society has. My mother had a copy also. But in it, she describes what it looked like when they redid it for the school. And she says, Ethel Rouse says, during these years, the makeshift shelter was all gone, and the hole nearly filled in with sand by the wind. These two intrepid pioneers, that's the widow McCarter and Riley, who was a bachelor, with the aid of a scoop shovel and the bachelor's mules, dug out the sand, and by going to every homesteader in the community and asking for anything at all that could be used in a building, they got enough material to board up the sides of a 4-foot deep hole in the sand and the sides of a 12-foot by 14-foot room with a corrugated iron roof, gathered from wrecked cars at the depot. So they had the framework of the school in which I was to teach that year. They left 4 holes in the walls for windows. One was complemented with the only glass window donated in the entire area. 2 were shutters built of lumber which could be raised and secured on a stick when open, and the 4th remained just a hole in the wall for lack of lumber. Brush was placed on the corrugated iron roof to keep it cooler. So, this picture here shows my great-grandmother Gladys and another child, I don't know who, but you can see kind of in that's the lifted up window with the stick that holds it up. Sorry, I'm kind of in your way, aren't I? No. So, anyway, that's that book. Let's see, and the dugout school was used for about a year until a wooden structure was built across the street sometime around 1913. And that's a picture of it. That's Ann and Riley standing on the steps of the school. Sorry.
Where is that school located, Randa?
Pardon? It was on the corner, the opposite corner from the dugout. So that would be the
Okay.
northwest corner of Bubbling Wells and Dillon.
Okay.
That's where it was. And Mercy McCarter, and this is my grandma Gladys, and this is Carl Atkinson, who was her cousin.
So would that be where the Sands are resort is now?
It's the opposite corner from that. It's where they just now recently built a house with a chain link fence around it. Yeah, that one, that's where it was. And I don't know what happened and why it fell down, but they quit using it, so. Anyway, let's see, that was about 1913 when they built that. Riley proved up on his claim in 1912, and then he was free to subdivide his land, which he did, which is how the rest of my family came out here. In December of 1913, my great-grandma Mattie and her daughter Gladys came out to Riley's to recover from pneumonia, and they stayed in the dugout, which by that time wasn't being used as a school because they've now built the next school. They were brought out by Mattie's brother Walter, who told about it in his autobiography, which I have one copy of it, and been invaluable. I'm gonna get it for a copy for the Historical Society. But Walter writes this. My sister Mattie and her daughter Gladys had pneumonia and had just gotten over it. They were pretty bad. This was about in November 1913. Jack Riley, who married my older sister later, had a homestead out near Palm Springs, and he wanted her to come out there so the girl could get well again. Her husband couldn't go because he had to work, so they asked me if I would take them. I was tickled to death. I said I would, and I went around December 13th. I had a really good time out there. We lived in the dugout, but Jack lived in another house he had built on the 160 acres. We used to have to haul our own water and had to rustle our food too because we had to ship it in from Los Angeles by freight. I used to hunt rabbits. There were lots of rabbits out there at that time, and dove, and that was about all we ate. It was about 6 miles to the post office, and I'd go down there every day to pick up the mail, and on the way back, I'd hunt rabbits.
Wow.
So anyway, a very interesting thing. He wanted to homestead, and he found 80 acres. Walter found 80 acres to homestead, but he was too young to homestead it, and so Mattie had to hold it for him, and he worked it, but he wasn't old enough to really have it. So anyway, they worked on all winter digging a well with a pick and shovel, and my sister helped me along with another friend. We got down about 80 feet when I quit. Anyway, fun book, full of all sorts of interesting tales. And I also have, and we have it here, a picture of the patent deed for him, for Walter. Okay. Whoops, sorry about that. Onward and upward. Okay, some things were happening in the world. We had, in 1914, World War I and World War I veterans. Oh, no, I'll get to that, Sarah, I'm not there yet.
Okay.
World War I veterans came to the desert after they'd been gassed in France to recover. In 1915, long-distance telephones were more common. In 1918, there was a worldwide influenza epidemic, and a lot of people came out to the desert to recuperate from that. There were 500,000 deaths in the United States. In 1919, Prohibition and the Roaring '20s. Now, in 1917, Walter Hemmingsen married Stella Ziegler. Oh, wait a minute. You're right, Sarah. I did miss that part. I did miss that part. Okay. Jack Riley's mother, Louisa, came out and homesteaded off of Indian Avenue over by Garnet, another 160 acres. And so this is her house, listed as just Mrs. Riley's house. You can see the clothing that they're wearing to be homesteading out in the desert. And she also brought with his younger brother William, And probably some other children, we're not sure until I get a chance to talk to their relatives more closely. Desert Hot Springs continued to see new settlers like Randa Ray, Cabot Yerxa, and in Palm Springs, Harry and Nellie Kaufman. Yeah, that's another picture of the gang out at Mrs. Riley's homestead. You can kind of see the background of Mount San Jacinto in the back, right? They look like something out of the Hatfield and McClure. So, Walter's got a job driving the stage for Dr. Kaufman, and they brought in a passenger bus in 1916, which he didn't know how to drive, so they had to teach him how. Anyway, so there's Walter and Stella. They got married, and she came out to live on the homestead that he had claimed. So he built a 14 by 24 structure, and after he didn't hit water, he gave up and went back to LA with her, and they waited for a while before they came back. In 1920, Jack Riley married Ann Hemmingsen and Jacobsen, by now widowed and living with her parents. Oh, by the way, that is Stella. This is Stella and their first child, Wilbur. And I don't know who that person is, and then that's Riley. Okay. Sorry about that, getting ahead of myself. Let's see. So Ann and Carl, her 14-year-old son, moved out from Los Angeles or San Pedro to live in the desert, although they had all known each other. But they moved out there, and that's Ann and Riley in 1920. And they added on rooms, enlarged his homestead house. And in fact, in later years, Walter wrote, Ann and Jack Riley's house had so many lean-tos on it that Jack wanted to put one big roof on it and cover the whole house so it would look like a fairly decent place. When I was talking to Riley's relative yesterday, the newly discovered person, Jay, he says, yeah, you know, that house had a double roof. And I'm like, it did? So that explains why it had a double roof, because they roofed over the whole thing, which helped keep it cooler, by the way. Riley drilled wells, he worked on construction, he tried farming corn in Willow Hole, but there wasn't enough reliable water to make a go of it. And later the wind scoured out that sandy soil and deepened the hole so that it used to be a little shallower, and then the hole got deeper and deeper and deeper from him having done that digging. And the tamarisk trees that used to grow there are gone because the county just cut them down and burned them. And there's no standing water there anymore. Now in 1921, the second scandal with my family took place with my grandmother, Gladys Boyser, who eloped with Richard Lee Baldwin, my grandfather, on August the 30th, 1921. Again, it's a newspaper article. They were 17 years old, high school sophomores, and Richard left his dad a touching note explaining, Gladys and I have gotten married and we are leaving. We know where we're going. Please forgive us, we'll be back in a week. His father, E.E. Baldwin, was an LAPD sergeant, and his main job was looking for lost children. And so that's why this whole thing in here, somewhere in here, it talks about that this was his job, and here now he's having to hunt for his own child, the parable of the prodigal son. Anyway, and I have other news clippings on that, but you don't need to know that. But anyway, his father went after him, tracked him down, but it was too late, because on February 24th, my Uncle Richard was born. And 2 years later, my mother, Virginia, was born. So, that was the second great scandal of my family. In 1925, Walter came back to the desert, finally hit water, got a windmill, and enlarged the house. He later wrote, we did very well there because we had no bills to pay, no taxes, just gas and groceries. He raised hogs and chickens. He sold eggs and roosters to the Desert Inn in Palm Springs and found work there as a carpenter. Because remember, he had known the Kaufmans. And the Kaufmans were the ones who ended up later with the inn in Palm Springs. Now, about that time, my great-grandmother, Mattie, divorced Florimond, and in 1927 she married Thomas Albert Jackson of Seattle, an immigrant from England via Canada to Seattle. And my speculation is that Grandma Mattie divorced Florimond, went to Seattle to avoid the scandal, met Albert because her brother
Scandal
was
number
living in
3.
Seattle. I don't know. You know, you don't have anybody to ask, so what?
It wasn't in the newspaper this time?
So anyway, do I have a picture for Florimond? I can't remember.
Earlier.
It was earlier, okay. Let's see, in 1924, my mother, Virginia Jacobsen, was born, and neither Gladys nor Dick were mature enough to be good parents to Richard and Virginia. So they sent my Uncle Richard to live with Dick's grandparents in Santa Rosa, California. And my mother, Virginia, was shuttled around from family member to friend her until she was 7 years old. So there's her pictures of her here, Mattie with mom when she was a baby, Anne with mom when she was a year old. That's actually my mom at 3 or 2, I think she was 2. This is on the desert at Jack's place with her dog, she was 3. Here she is by Anne's reservoir, and that's in the desert also at Jack's place. So they sent her off. I think the next slide shows her in Riley's cornfield as a little kid. So you can see he did have a tractor. He was plowing, and then he tried to raise corn, but it doesn't look like it was very happy. Not happy corn. When she was 7 years old, she went to Santa Rosa to live permanently with her father, sister, and family, and she remained there until 1944 when she married my dad, Ed Jacobsen, but she came back to Desert Hot Springs often. She remembered, she used to tell us that when she would come out to the desert with Mattie and Al, they'd come down through the grapevine, if you know where the grapevine is, up by, between what? Ohio Valley now, it wasn't there then, but anyway, just above Banning in Beaumont toward LA. She'd come down through the grapevine there on the road, and there was a little bar at the bottom, and they would always stop there and have a couple drinks, and she had to wait in the car. She remembers that. Anyway, in 1926, the county put in Highway 99, or paved Highway 99, what we now know as Varner, making 2 roads through the valley that were really paved. Oh, how did I miss that picture? Yeah, there we go.
This is, but you want to, is this grandma again?
Oh yeah, that's yeah. This is later, that's my mom. I forgot I had that one in there. My great-grandma Mattie, my grandmother Gladys, my grandfather Dick, and my mother on the desert. So they came back and forth. Okay. This building is on the 99, and it was under construction. I think I have 3 slides of that. So there, and that one, as it's being built, it looks almost right. And then the next one is the picture when it was finished, and that's Walter's car right there in it. So that was on what is now the base of Mountain View, although it didn't connect at that time. And that was the main highway that went through. So that right about then is when they started making the road, the dirt road connect, so that they could get there easier. Let's see. So in 1929, there was a stock market crash. And Walter and Jack Riley kept working in Palm Springs because Walter says the people in Palm Springs were really well heeled. And the depression didn't seem to affect them right away. So they kept working over there. Gary Cooper, the actor, Gary Cooper's father bought 30 acres from Walter and surveyed it and staked it. That's down there close to 20th and Mountain View, actually that way, Merganser Road. But anyway, bought some land and subdivided it and laid it all out and nobody bought it. So it was kind of went away. But also, somebody up the hill drilled for oil. I did not know that anybody tried to drill for oil here, but they drilled for oil up below what we now call Edom Hill and the Dump, somewhere in that section. But Walter wrote in his book, I never heard about getting any oil, so it must have been a dry hole. The Depression worsened. Wages in Palm Springs fell from $8 a day to $7 a day, and then later on to $6 a day. So Walter and Stella left the desert and went to Seattle, where his brother Rob lived, and they stayed there until 1930. Now, sometime around 1929, Al and Mattie Jackson purchased 5 acres from Riley at what is now 17529 Mountain View Road, where I live. According to Family Lore, they had a good year at the restaurant, lost their lease because of increased naval activity at the shipyard, and they left San Pedro. The 1930 census doesn't show them anywhere. But it does list Louisa and William Riley, Jack Riley, Walter and Stella Hemmingsen, and along with sons Wilbur, Don, and Robert. And nobody had a radio, because that was a new question on the census form. Is there a radio in the household? Nobody had a radio. In
Excuse me, we have to.
I know, I understood that you had to, and I apologize for running long.
It was
I'm
very
long-winded.
interesting, very interesting.
They're recording it,
Thank you.
so if you wanna see it, it'll be on the Historical Society website,
Okay, thank you.
okay? Let's see, in 1931, construction began on Aqueduct Road, which is now known as Dillon Road. And it had a couple of extra little fingers because it connected over to Thousand Palms, where Thousand Palms Canyon is, and there are several roads now in that area called Aqueduct Road. There's one that goes off up to the aqueduct itself, called Aqueduct Road. But the original Aqueduct Road was the one that went from Indio all the way up to Highway 62. So that was Aqueduct Road. And the construction on that was something that was a way for people to make money during the Depression. So that was a good thing. But at that time, Walter and Riley started working for Bender and Hubbard, which you may know by B-Bar H, as in the B-Bar H Ranch. They built the stone houses that are down there. And they also built a house for brother George Hemmingsen on Dillon, which is opposite Avenida Manzana, kind of, that would be south of Dillon. And next door to his property, Carl Atkinson's place on Dillon and Bubbling Wells. And that's when they finally put the roof on Riley's collection of lean-tos and put in a basement. In 1944, in 1923, they started building on their house. So you can see that, go back one slide, would you, Sharon? Okay, the first thing they built was the house, that's in 31. And they put up fencing around it.
That's on
Huh?
our property now.
Yeah, that's our property now. And so here they are, setting the fence posts. Big, old, heavy 4x4s, which are still there, some of them. Yeah, some of them are chain link, but some of those big old ones are still there. So this was the original house on my property. Then the next slide shows how that they were drilling a well. And Tarbutton, oh, I can't think of his last name, of his first name. Anyway, he was a well driller, Riley was a well driller. So that's them putting in this well on the property on Mountain View.
Does the aquifer go that far down?
Pardon?
Does the aquifer go that far south? Is that well getting water from the aquifer?
I don't know
Well,
where.
you said it had a peculiar smell, so maybe it isn't the same.
It's not Desert Hot Springs water, no. It's very alkaline, and it has like 1,700 parts per million or something. So
You're still using that well.
Yeah, we're still using that well. It's been deepened once. But we are still using that well, but we don't normally drink that water. We have RO water to drink. But my mother drank that water and lived to be to 95, so. Maybe it preserved her. So they put in a well, a tank house, a reservoir, a little house called Sunny Dean, which is back behind here. You saw my grandma in front of that. That was for family who came to visit, because people came to visit all the time. They put in a chicken house and planted, this is for you, Larry, fruit trees, pomegranate, citrus, and dates.
Wow.
They,
Is that a pool you guys have?
I'm sorry, what?
It's not a reservoir,
Oh, that reservoir.
I'm
but
sorry.
they did swim in it.
Oh, okay,
Yeah, and so this is where they were digging the reservoir.
okay.
So the early pictures that you see of this tank house here are, you don't see the siding on it. It's just the pillars, and the pillars are giant piers from Long Beach piers. From the docks.
Wow.
And they are massive. They're like 2 feet across, and the thing is still there. The wood's falling off the outside, but that thing is still there.
Wow.
And it still has a tank on top of it, although we don't use it.
Rhonda, how did they get water into the tank?
There was a windmill, and the power of the windmill drove the water up out of the ground and into the tank, and then the overflow from that, you'd watch the little level on the side, and if the wind was blowing too hard, you had to turn off the windmill so that it wouldn't spin itself to death. Yeah, and then you would keep an eye on it, because you might run out of water before the winds calm down again, and you can turn it back on. So there was a little gauge on the side. And I remember my dad going up and monkeying with it, because it would get stuck. And whenever there was a leak in the tank, because they rushed it was just metal, they rushed it. And so they'd go up with a tar brush, and they would tar the inside of the tank. So inside that, we drank all that water full of tar. We didn't know any better. You know, and I'm 75, so there you go. That's my Grandpa Al in the pool, in the reservoir. So for years after they built that, that was how we watered all the plants. Because the reservoir was the overflow from the tank. The tank fed the house gravity feed, and the reservoir still has, you can see them, has little pipes at different levels. And then on each side, there would be a spigot to turn it on or off, so that you could irrigate the back out of this one, and you could irrigate the front by turning this one on or off. So there were 4 or 5 different outflows to irrigate whatever you happen to be wanting to irrigate. And I wish we still had it. The windmill, we took the windmill down in the 60s.
And finally complying with the Homestead Act.
Pardon?
Finally complying with the Homestead
Yes.
Act.
Well, in the Homestead Act, you had to improve it. You didn't have to,
Irrigate.
you didn't have to irrigate. That was only the Desert Lands Act. Okay, so they planted oleanders in the driveway. These are tiny little oleanders that are coming along there. That's my Al, my great grandmother Maddie, and my mother right before she went up to Santa Rosa. You can see this line here on the side. Theoretically, you weren't supposed to get the water any higher than that, but that was our old windmill. Yeah, not said enough already. Okay, let's see, they planted tamarisks all around of the front of it to have a windbreak, by the way. And they also, this is Ann Riley and Jack Riley's house out front. You can see their trees. They had turkeys and chickens and sheep and goats. And then this is the inside of Riley's house. You can see it was all set up for dinner. The date palms, those are date palms they brought in and planted at the end of our driveway, and they had 4 different varieties, 2 on each side And unfortunately, they died in later years, but when I was a kid, they still had dates on them. And then there's Maddie with her pomegranates. I don't know if you can see them, but they're this big.
Yeah.
And see how she's put that little windbreak behind? They latticed the windbreaks so that it would keep the wind from blowing the fruit off the tree. We're out in the past, we get a lot of wind. Riley had a dovecot, and I remember going there as a child and looking up in the dovecot to see if there was any eggs I could throw at something. Let's see, do I have another slide of that, Sarah? I don't remember. Oh, okay, no.
Oh, yeah.
In 1933, the Colorado Aqueduct was begun, bringing water to Los Angeles. It was a massive operation. They constructed 29 16-foot tunnels over 91 miles. 33 miles of which go through these hills to the north of us.
Are these pictures from here?
Pardon?
Are these pictures from this
Yes,
area?
yeah, these are from here. And they go behind Desert Hot Springs, but all the way down the valley, you can see about where Dillon turns to go off to the right toward Indio, the aqueduct continued on that way, on its way over toward Blythe.
When did Maddie or Gladys, I don't know, was in the previous picture, start wearing pants?
Yeah, I remember my grandma Maddie always wore big, like, riding pants with the wide legs.
Yeah.
And I don't know when she started wearing them, but she did wear them when I knew her, the wide leg pants.
At least in the late 20s and 30s, we've seen photos of her in pants.
Yeah, but they look like dresses. You know, they really did look like dresses. So there's Maddie there, and Al Kreisel. I don't know if you've ever heard that name. That's a desert person also. And there they are in the mouth of one of those big aqueduct tunnels that was being constructed. That's right out there by us. Let's see, I need to hurry through this. I'm running late.
Some of the aqueduct workers lived on our property, right?
Pardon? Yeah, and I do get to that. So there were thousands of workers who lived in the camps while they were building. It took them a couple of years to build the aqueduct. And Riley and Walter brought in some little houses from the 1932 Summer Olympics in Los Angeles that had been used to house athletes. They brought them in from Los Angeles, put them on the property, and when I was talking to Jay yesterday, he said, yeah, I think there were 6 of them, and they were the little houses that were right on the corner of Dillon Road and Mountain View, where when I was a kid, there was only one left, and now there's none, and people have yard sales there. But that's where they were. And then my grandparents converted their chicken house into lodging, and so they had 2 little units there. We call them the single and the double. They're still there. And there was an outhouse out back. It had actually had a septic tank and water by that time, of course. But they were not no indoor plumbing on that. So anyway, they rented those out to the people who were working on the aqueduct. And also in 1933, FDR's New Deal came out, and the WPA in 1935 that employed some of the local people in building the Palms to Pines Highway and other various civic improvements. In 1940, the voter registration form shows John Riley as a well driller, his brother William as a boiler maker, and Al Jackson as a cook, and Maddie, my great-grandmother, as a housewife. By 1940, the ranch, it's always been called the ranch, looked pretty good. So there it is, the 1940 picture. But Al and Maddie weren't satisfied. They decided to build a bigger house. Now I'll show you this. You can see there's the main house. This is the one that had the 2 side doors that you could open for a garage. And they lived on this side, and they had the lattice built over it and the lattice around the back to guard from the wind. But you can see all the tamarasks for wind. This is the reservoir here, surrounded by rocks. That's Sunny Dean. And this white building in the back that you can kind of see is the chicken houses that were converted into rentals,
Brenda.
so.
Mount San Gorgonio in the background, and Devil's Garden, Mount San Gorgonio.
It looks like that, but it's taken at such an angle, but I never see that picture because I was looking toward Palm Springs. But yeah, that's San Gorgonio.
Okay, thank you.
That would be the San Bernardino Mountains.
Pardon?
That's the San Bernardino
Yeah,
Mountains.
San
like big-
Gorgonio's on this side of the pass,
Yeah.
and San Jacinto's on that side. And it's taken aiming that way. So, yeah, thank you for pointing that out, because I hadn't even noticed that, Terry, I'm used to that picture. Anyway, they decided to build a bigger house and move the small one back behind where it still is. Although, and they lived in it when they sold the property to my parents. But it's still there. We use it as a tool house, but my brother lived in it for a while. I lived in it when I was 20 and recently married. So it's still there. Let's see. Al began digging the foundations and he contracted with a builder to construct a 5-room house. There he is digging putting in the pillars for the carport. That's the backyard there. You can see it's not quite done yet. And this is how it looked when it got done. So that's what we call now the big house. And it cost him 5 payments of $1,070 each. These are the blueprints for that house. Yeah, they are definitely blue.
Yeah.
So yeah, blueprints for the house. And I have a contract and all of that. Riverside County hasn't caught up with figuring out what it is, so I don't know. Anyway, but I know that it was that. And let's
Is that
see.
the house you live in now?
That's the house I live in now, yeah. It has a small porch out back behind the fireplace, a pepper tree, grass, and a fence to keep the coyotes away from the cats. And the porch has now been enclosed and enlarged actually twice, and that's why our back porch slopes, and then it slopes again, because they were both supposed to be outside, and you have to tilt the water in case it rains, took it away. So you walk out on our, we call it the picture porch, the back porch, and you kind of, everything slants down a little bit. But it works. So by the time that the new house was completed, Maddie had a new chicken house and had, oh yeah, that's the contract there. But Maddie had a chicken house, a new chicken house, and Al there, very proud, in front of his car. Let's see, no air conditioning, but we slept out on the porch or out in the yard under the trees. There were hammocks out there. And when I was a kid, we had a chaise lounge. Yeah, they had chaise lounges by then, and so we slept out there on those sometimes until we could get a swamper. They did put a swamper in at one point, so that was a good thing. Okay, Maddie's sister Flora and her husband John Shire bought the property right behind the ranch, and because he worked for the Long Beach Bus Company, they brought out an old bus to live in. You can see it there. And they lived in that while they built their property. And you can see along the what is now 18th, called 18th, but it was called Power Line Road, and that they had started putting in power line at that time.
This is in the 40s?
Huh? Yeah. Yeah. Now, I've got like only 4 more slides, so. The next 2 pictures are the big house about 1950. I was born in Santa Rosa in 1954. And in 1954, when I was 5, my parents bought the ranch from Grandma Maddie and Grandpa Al and changed the name of it to the Double J Ranch for Jackson Jacobsen. And John, my brother, was born in 1958 and has lived on the property his whole life. My dad was a gardener in Palm Springs until he started the Desert Hot Springs Nursery that's on Flora in Desert Hot. My brother still works there. And while I left for a time, my mother stayed on the ranch for the rest of her life. I moved back in 2014. That's the old converted chicken house, as you can see. So that's about in the 1950s. So we moved back, Bob and I moved back to take care of Mom in 2013, and we stayed with her until she passed away in 2019, so we enjoyed being with her. 1 week short of 95, so I guess the water wasn't that bad after all. And that's me, when we moved there when I was 5. So, yeah.